Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the Media Lab and Jamila especially and Jess who brought me over here. I'm honored to be speaking at the start of such a wonderful day. I'm honored to be in the presence of the great women that you will see being honored today. Now, I usually start my talks like this. My name is Mona Eltahawy, and my declaration of faith is fuck the patriarchy. To be more specific, and to quote the great Black feminist bell hooks, fuck the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. And the reason that I begin my declaration of faith like this is because I'm a woman of color, because I'm of Muslim descent, and because of many reasons that have to do with all of these identities of mine and the fact that not many women of my background get to stand on a stage. I have to say that because in that act of defiance, in that act of disobedience, in that act of disruption, I discomfort the powerful, and the powerful today is patriarchy across the world, because patriarchy is universal and quotidian. As far back as 1959, the Black queer playwright Lorraine Hansberry said in an interview with Studs Terkel that the most oppressed group of any oppressed group are its women, and therefore they are compelled to be twice as militant in order to get our message across. So I say, fuck the patriarchy, because being nice and polite got us nowhere. And rude women are free women. Profane women are free women. And angry women are free women. And most of the women that I quote and that I will be quoting with you today are women of color and queer people, because discomfort and disobedience live in the margins. Now, Ethan gave you many great examples of the power of the disobedience that begins in the margins, and I want to give you some more, specifically women from around the world. I want to start with the Egyptian feminist Nawal al-Saadawi, who is a great personal mentor of mine and someone I've had the honor to interview many times. In her novel, Woman at Point Zero, the protagonist of this novel is a sex worker who is about to be executed for killing a man, one of the Johns, one of her clients. And at one point, the powers that be that are interrogating her tell her, "You are a savage and dangerous woman." And she replies, "The truth is savage and dangerous." And that's why we are here today, to acknowledge the truth. And what is that truth? The truth is that I am standing here today to share with you the importance of fuck the patriarchy as an incredible Ugandan queer feminist called Stella Nyanzi is in prison in Kampala for the second time in 2 years. Why is Stella Nyanzi in prison in Kampala, a country that has been run by the same leader, Yoweri Museveni, for the past 31 years? Now, patriarchy, regardless of where it lives and how it manifests its power, is a form of authoritarianism, obviously. And if anyone doubts that feminism terrifies authoritarians, meet Stella Nyanzi. Last year, Stella Nyanzi was dragged from her home by a group of about a dozen security forces and placed in a maximum security prison because she dared, in a Facebook post, to call this dictator of 31 years, Museveni of Uganda, a pair of buttocks. Why did Stella Nyanzi call Museveni a pair of buttocks? Because during his election campaign, he promised to address period poverty in Uganda. Now, in Uganda, it is estimated that 60% of girls cannot afford any kind of sanitary napkins and drop out of school, or their schooling suffers. And around the world, we know that girls, women, and people who menstruate also suffer from period poverty. Now, this is something that affects at least half of society, if not more, and yet it is used as a cheap election promise by Museveni, and then when he got into power, his wife, who also happens to be the education minister, coincidentally, said that they didn't have enough funds. Now, a lot of aid groups and UNICEF have estimated that, as I said, 60% of Ugandan schoolgirls are affected by school poverty, and that many of the girls drop out of school and end up being subjected to child marriage. So Stella Nyanzi took to Facebook and called Museveni a pair of buttocks was put in maximum security prison, and it didn't stop at that. She was kept there for 5 weeks, and when she was finally released, she was subjected to an insanity test, because of course only crazy women would dare to challenge patriarchy. But also she did not stop at that, because she started her own campaign to raise funds for sanitary napkins for schoolgirls. She has been leading marches against violence against women and girls and trans people in Uganda. And just a few weeks ago, she was thrown into prison again, because to celebrate Museveni's 74th birthday, she wrote a poem on Facebook wishing that his mother had never given birth to him. So she was accused of insulting the president and his late mother. So as I said, profane women, disobedient women are free women. She might be in prison, but she's definitely a free woman. Now, I'm going to share a quote with you from Stella Nyanzi about why she is profane. And she follows a wonderful tradition in Uganda called radical rudeness that was used by anti-colonial powers during British occupation. And Stella Nyanzi says, Uganda was colonized and Christianized by the British. We were brought up to be good girls, to be decent, to be polite, to speak nicely to authority. Women here are not to be heard, they shut up, they don't speak. They're to be seen as beautiful, which is why I say, fuck the patriarchy. Now, Stella Nyanzi is not the only feminist that I want to share the story of with you today. I'm also here to honor at least 12, if not more, women's rights activists and feminists in Saudi Arabia. Now, as we're meeting here today, the G20, mostly men, mostly male leaders of the most powerful countries in the world, and perhaps 1 or 2 women who were given space in that narrow corridor of power, are meeting in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And among them is a crown prince who is the de facto ruler of his country, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Many of you might know who this man is, because he is suspected to have ordered the brutal murder and dismemberment of a Saudi journalist called Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd. That might be the first time that many of you have heard of Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi royal family, because they don't often register on the world's radar. But for me as a Muslim woman, they have definitely registered, because Saudi Arabia is home to the 2 holiest sites for Muslims. My family moved to Saudi Arabia when I was a teenager, and Saudi Arabia provides the world with so much oil and in turn buys so much weapons and arms from manufacturers across the world, including mostly the United States, Canada, and many EU countries. So many of you, for many of you, the story might have begun and ended with Jamal Khashoggi, because it's men's stories that usually count. But I'm here to talk about women's stories, because today is a day to honor women, women who say fuck the patriarchy. Some of you might, maybe, hopefully, have heard about the ruinous Yemen war, which has been supported by the US and the UK and many other powers, that has pushed that poorest country in the Middle East and North Africa to the brink of one of the worst famines in history. If you've heard about the Yemen war, that is a good thing, because we will hear about children. But I guarantee that most of you have not heard of the guardianship system, that not only Mohammed bin Salman, this crown prince, but a whole host of his ancestors have kept that kingdom under. And the guardianship system is the very foundation of patriarchy. The guardianship system determines that Saudi women can barely do anything without the signature of a male guardian. And that same guardianship system translates into the kafala or sponsorship system, by which the lives of migrant workers are made miserable, because they're basically rendered as indentured servitude, modern-day slaves. And who among migrant workers is most affected? Women, female migrant workers. So when you heard about Jamal Khashoggi being murdered so horrendously in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, did you hear of an Indonesian domestic worker called Tuti, who was executed by the Saudis after spending 8 years on death row because she dared to fight back against her employer in Saudi Arabia, who was sexually abusive and was trying to rape her, and she killed him in the process. She spent 8 years on death row and was beheaded for defending herself against a sexually abusive employer. I am sure hardly any of you have heard of Tuti. Maybe some of you might have heard of the Saudi Feminists. Those Saudi Feminists right now have been found, because their relatives have given the news to human rights organizations, to have been flogged by electric cables. Some of them have been hung from the ceiling as they were interrogated. Several of them have been sexually abused, and at least one of them has tried to commit suicide 3 times. Do you think any of this is going to be on the agenda of the G20 in Buenos Aires? How many of the male leaders and the female leaders at the G20 will shake the hands of the murderous and the authoritarian patriarch Mohammed bin Salman? I've already been sent pictures and video today of Putin, no surprise, of Modi, the leader of India, no surprise, and I do not doubt that what I call the fascist fuck president of the United States will shake this man's hand. Because Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, as terrible as what these two men have been doing recently, they are not the innovators, they are not the inventors of patriarchy or racism or misogyny. They have taken decades of racism, patriarchy, misogyny, capitalism, imperialism, you name it, every ism I'm here to fight. And they have perfected it and taken it to the nth degree. So pay attention to what footage comes out of the G20, because that's what we should be defying and disobeying and disrupting. Because the theme of my talk today is feminism in 3D. And Stella Nianzi and the Saudi Feminists and some more women that I will be talking to you about, Lorraine Hansberry, who I've already mentioned, are the perfect embodiment of feminism in 3D. And those 3Ds are disobedience, obviously, defiance, and disruption. And I usually talk about feminism in 3D because a lot of young women come to my talks. They hear me begin my talk with fuck the patriarchy, and they think that I came out of my mother's womb saying fuck the patriarchy. And obviously I didn't. It took a long time to get here. And so many of them ask me, you know, I don't march, I don't protest, I don't have the time, I have 3 jobs, I'm scared, my parents won't let me. During the Egyptian Revolution, I'm an Egyptian. And during the Egyptian Revolution, I would hear from many young women who have curfews, who could not go to Tahrir Square, who could not join all the revolutionaries. So they would often ask me, how do I embody fuck the patriarchy? And so I tell them, find ways in which daily you can disobey, defy, and disrupt the patriarchy. So clearly profanity is one of my favorite ways to defy and disrupt and disobey the patriarchy. But there are many other ways too. And when I talk about the Saudi feminists who are in prison and being tortured, and when I talk about Stella Nianzi, who was sent to a maximum security prison for daring to call Museveni a pair of buttocks, I know that it scares a lot of people because they think, you know, I don't want to go to prison. Not everyone is able to or wants to be incarcerated. There are other ways to defy and disobey and disrupt. But before I tell you about the other ways, I want to emphasize the fact that risk is so important. You heard from Ethan about several people who risked, and risk is imperative, because without risk, the patriarchs, the powers that be, do not take us seriously. When I was watching the run-up to the Kavanaugh confirmations, the women who went to the Senate and the House, the women who went to Congress were incredible. The women who disrupted Jeff Flake's elevator ride and made him so upset, and then what? The women who shared their stories, the women who keep figuratively rather, hopefully not literally, figuratively cutting open veins to spill out awful stories of sexual violence. I was watching this and I was so fucking enraged. Then what? Then what? And I kept thinking, we have to make patriarchy fear us. Because without patriarchy fearing us, they do not take us seriously. How do we make patriarchy fear us? It's good to make Jeff Flake pretend to have a conscience. But then what? Because Kavanaugh was confirmed. Then what? Donald Trump was elected president despite the grab them by the pussy comment, despite the more than a dozen women who accused him of sexual assault. Donald Trump and so many other white men were elected and voted for and supported by the majority of white women in this country. I call them foot soldiers of the patriarchy. How do we make patriarchy fear us? Now, we often need to give ourselves optimism and reasons to be optimistic, and I'm a tenacious optimist, and I believe at the heart of revolution, as well as defiance, disobedience, and disruption, is the need for optimism. Because optimism is an incredible weapon, and we must never surrender it. And so I talk about the women in Ireland, because I was in Dublin in October. And I'm honored to know so many feminists in Ireland who were incredible in their revolution against the Catholic Church, against the patriarchy in Ireland, in repealing the 8th Amendment, which was put into their constitution in the 1980s to criminalize abortion. But I want you to remember, before I share this story of optimism, that Ireland, this incredibly, well, it used to be conservative, but still very Catholic country, was able, by popular referendum, to pass marriage equality in 2015 before it repealed the 8th Amendment in 2018. So basically, everybody's rights before women's rights. Remember that. Remember that we are more than half of the society, everywhere across the world, but basically everybody's rights are recognized before our rights. But the Irish women did it. And the Irish women did it how? The Irish women did it by bravely sharing their stories, like those women in the elevator with Jeff Flake and the other women who confronted their senators. And the power of that is the power of subversion through the disobedience, defiance, and disruption. Because I believe that the most subversive thing that a woman can do is to talk about her life as if it matters, because it does. So many times we're told, who cares about your story? This is your story at home. Who cares about your story? This is your story in the workplace. The most subversive thing a woman can do is to talk about her life as if it matters, because it does. And proof of that is that when they took a poll, the exit polls in Ireland, that helped repeal the 8th Amendment and pave the way to decriminalize abortion in Ireland, people were asked, what was the most effective thing? What was the thing that made you change your mind? And it wasn't politicians getting up on stage and talking on television about how the time has come, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't even like the pamphlets that people were handing out at the various protests. It was about women's stories. It was about women talking about their abortion. It was about women talking about how they had to go to England to get an abortion because Ireland wouldn't give them one. It was about women and how their lives were endangered. It was about an Indian woman living in Ireland called Savita, who was denied an abortion and died several years ago. And now there is a mural to her on the streets, on a wall in Dublin. And Savita's story is again a recognition that the stories of defiance, disruption, and disobedience invariably start among the most marginalized and the least heard. This was a woman of color in a very white country, in a very Catholic country, a woman for whom abortion was not against her beliefs and yet was subjected to this patriarchal and ultimately murderous criminalization of our ability to control our bodies. So the women in Ireland did it through the power of stories, through the power of disobedience, disruption, and defiance. The women in Ireland and their ability to terrify the Catholic Church and their ability to terrify authority and patriarchy then take me to China. Next year, the Chinese Communist Party will commemorate 70 years in power. It is the longest-running communist party in the world. Why would the Communist Party in China in 2015 throw 5 feminists in prison? They became known as the Feminist Five. Because those activists, along with a string of other activists, dared to speak out against intimate partner violence by taking to the streets in Beijing, in a variety of other cities, wearing white wedding dresses splashed with red paint to portray so-called domestic violence. I don't like the word domestic violence because it makes it seem quiet and private. It is not quiet and private, it is ugly. Intimate partner violence. And those women dared, on the day that they were arrested, International Women's Day, March 8th, to prepare stickers to take to their subway stations to speak out and to fight against sexual violence and sexual harassment on mass transportation. And they were imprisoned for 38 days for daring to say, we deserve to be free of violence. We deserve to be able to ride the subway without violence and without sexual harassment of any kind. I had the great honor to meet one of these feminist activists, a young woman called Datu. This is her nom de guerre. It means giant rabbit. And just as an example of how effective these wonderful women are, I recommend, first of all, that you read a great book by a very good friend of mine called Eltahawy Fincher, and this book is called Betraying Big Brother, and it is about the feminist movement in contemporary China. And Datu was so effective in her feminism and in her ability and the ability of the Feminist Five to terrify the patriarchy in China because they made alliances with workers, because they went to various factories in China, including the factories that make this and other electronics, and where especially the women are most impacted by that patriarchy that Bell Hooks has long been talking about. Maybe not so white supremacists in China, but definitely capitalists and imperialists in its own way. And so when Datu and the other feminist activists were imprisoned by the Chinese Communist Party in 2015, you had the workers also showing solidarity with them, including male workers who wrote on their bodies, "We support Datu, we support the Feminist Five." So remember that, even when they throw the feminists in prison, they are throwing them in prison because they are terrified of feminists. They are terrified of women who say, "Fuck the patriarchy." They are terrified of feminism in 3D. So I've taken you to China, to Ireland, to Saudi Arabia, to Uganda. I will also take you to South Korea, where women have been holding monthly protests against spy cams. Because in Korea, there has been an epidemic of spy cams, where men and boys place cameras in restrooms, in changing rooms, in shopping malls, and in various other places to capture on camera women undressing, going to the toilet, basically invading their privacy everywhere they go. And the police have done nothing. And I do not believe in a carceral solution to sexual violence. But when the police in a country with an epidemic of spy cams being used against women only act when women use it against a man, there is something wrong. And so women in South Korea have been holding monthly protests, holding up placards against the spy cams, shouting and chanting. And one of those protests, I think it was in May, perhaps April, was the largest ever protest of women in South Korean history. And one of my favorite placards from those protests says, "Angry women are free women. Angry women will change the world." However, the women in South Korea are mostly covering their face in the protests, because they might not be in prison right now, but it is still dangerous for them to show their face. So this is the risk that I'm talking about. There has to be risk involved. The people that we are fighting, and for me, there is nothing I fight more than patriarchy, across the world, universal and quotidian, has to understand that I am willing to take the risk, that you are willing to take the risk. We have to make them fear us. Now, for me personally, my own taking the risk was that I had the great honor to join a protest in Egypt in November of 2011. So our revolution happened earlier that year. For those of you who are following the 18 days in Tahrir Square, one of the things that is least reported is that a month after Mubarak was forced to step down by those protests, at least 17 female revolutionaries were subjected to so-called virginity tests, their sexual assaults, by our military. Because this is how patriarchy fights back. It tries to shame us, and it tries to silence us, and it does so with the threat of sex, violence, shame, and taboo. Sexual assault is about power and violence, it's not about sex. But they use the sexual assault of virginity tests because they know in Egypt, which is a very conservative country, a lot of families will prohibit their daughters from joining protests because of the taboo and shame around sex. And so one of the ways that I fight patriarchy in my own country, but also across the world, is to insist on talking about sex, is to insist on talking about my sexuality. And after what happened to me, especially so, and what happened to me is this very quickly. In almost exactly 7 years ago, I joined a protest very near Tahrir Square on a street called Mohammed Mahmoud. The Egyptian regime knows who I am because I have long been an opponent of our military-backed regime. And I was told by a human rights lawyer who now represents me that they handed out pictures of people they wanted. And they got me. And when the riot police got me, they broke both my arms, they sexually assaulted me, their supervising officer threatened me with gang rape, and I was detained in the Interior Ministry for 6 hours, and in military intelligence for another 6 hours, I was blindfolded and interrogated with 2 broken arms and denied medical attention. Now, I kind of gloss over that very quickly, because that is not the main point of the story. The main point of the story is I am alive and I am free, and I'm here talking to you, saying fuck the patriarchy. Thank you. But there's a bigger story than that, and the bigger story than that is that I am alive and I am free, and I'm here to say fuck the patriarchy because I am privileged. Because if I wasn't who I was, I would not be here. Because I'm a famous journalist, because people know who I am, because I have a big platform on Twitter, when I managed to get a tweet out when I was detained by the Interior Ministry, beaten, arrested Interior Ministry, I said, people paid attention, the world paid attention. Within 15 minutes, #FreeMona was trending globally. Al Jazeera and The Guardian reported about what happened to me, and the State Department tweeted back, I am so lucky. Because I'm a dual citizen, the State Department actually tried to do something about it. Had it happened today, I'm not so sure the fascist fuck in the White House would give a flying fuck. Anyway, so I am privileged, which is why I am free, which is why I'm alive. Had I been an anonymous working class Egyptian woman, had I been an anonymous migrant domestic worker in Saudi Arabia, had I been, I would not be alive, I would not be free, I would not be here in front of you. So let's remember that when we're defying, when we're disrupting, and when we're disobeying patriarchy and the various powers, remember that your privilege obliges you to fight back 10 times harder. And I want to especially honor Tarana Burke because she started Me Too, as Ethan said, many years before anyone was saying Me Too, but she's inspired so many of us in ways that I hope that she is aware. And I'm going to end my talk today, because I only just have a few minutes and I like to talk, so I have to be cognizant of the time, by sharing something positive with you that came out of a lot of pain. Earlier this year, in February, I heard that a young Pakistani Muslim woman posted on Facebook that when she went to our holy sites in Saudi Arabia, the holy site in Mecca, she was sexually assaulted. And this is, sadly, a very familiar story for me as a woman of Muslim descent, because very soon after my family moved to Saudi Arabia from the UK, I was born in Egypt, but we lived in the UK for a while, we went on pilgrimage, the Hajj, which is the 5th pillar of my religion. And during pilgrimage, in 1982, when I was 15 years old, I was sexually assaulted twice. Now, you heard about the silence in the Catholic Church. This silence exists everywhere, that patriarchy exists, and it is especially deadly and especially powerful in religious circles, because the sanctity of those religious places protects the men. Patriarchy protects and enables men everywhere. The sanctity of holy sites especially protects men, and men count on the fact that we, those subjected to their sexual violence, are going to be ashamed. And at first I was ashamed. For many years I couldn't talk about what happened to me. I was 15 years old. I had never been touched with consent or without consent like that. And to have that happen to me while I'm performing the 5th pillar of my religion totally fucked me over. I could not talk about it for years. And when I finally began to talk about it in a group of women over lunch in Cairo one day, an Egyptian Muslim woman said to me, hey, don't talk about this, you're going to make Muslims look bad. And I was like, fuck that. I'm not the one who makes Muslims look bad, it's the men who make the men look bad. And that applies to men of every group. Because as a Muslim woman, I know I have on one side the racists and the Islamophobes who do want to make Muslims look bad, and on this side I have the misogynists of my community who want me to shut up so that my men don't look bad, and I tell them to fuck off and I tell them to fuck off. So I share this story with you. I share this story with you not to give ammunition to the racists or the Islamophobes. I share this story with you because I'm able to speak about what happened to me. And when I heard about Sabika Khan in February, I thought, oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. This is still happening. And she was being shamed on her Facebook page. So I took to Twitter, inspired by Tarana Burke, inspired by all the incredible women speaking out, and I suggested to fellow Muslim women that we start talking about this under #MosqueMeToo. And within hours, it went viral. Because the need to speak out and the need to find allies and the need to find community is incredible. And that's how we strengthen and empower and uplift each other to perform the 3Ds that I'm talking about, feminism in 3D. And so I hear from Muslim women around the world now who say, my mother shared this story with me. I'm sharing this story with you. These stories are incredible. And these stories take me finally to Argentina. Because as a Muslim woman, I recognize, as I said, Tarana Burke inspired me. Tarana Burke is a black feminist activist. I've already quoted queer women from around the world, Chinese women. I've quoted Lorraine Hansberry. One of my kind of spiritual mentors, for lack of a better term, is the black bisexual poet June Jordan. I have her words tattooed on my arms. And the words that I chose to tattoo, I could have tattooed poems, is we are the ones we have been waiting for, touched on by Ethan, but essential and incredible to our revolutions. We are the ones we have been waiting for. And so when we find the ones who give us power, we recognize we are the ones we have been waiting for, and we share our power with others. So now, because of all these Muslim women speaking out, because of Sabiqa Khan in Pakistan, because of women in Saudi Arabia who are in prison, because of Stella Nianzi, I want to wrap up with something a group of Argentinian feminists and trans activists and queer activists wrote earlier this year when they were trying to get their Senate to decriminalize abortion. Sadly, it didn't work this time around, but they wrote an incredible statement that was published on the Verso website, because Verso has been publishing many of the writers who are involved with this movement called Ni Una Menos, which I believe is the Spanish for not one more. And this movement was begun by a collective in Argentina of feminists, queer rights activists, trans rights activists, and people who are determined to fuck the patriarchy over. And they wrote a statement on the eve of the vote in their Senate. And they said, whatever happens, we are reiterating, take your rosaries off our ovaries. We are reiterating, keep your militaries out of our territories. And we are reminding the Argentinian Senate that regardless of the vote tomorrow, abortion happens every day. We know that. It happens across the world, and I'm saying it especially now in the United States, because white women are finally paying attention to the fact that women of color have had abortion made almost impossible to them in this country. But white women only pay attention when it begins to affect them. White people generally in the United States only pay attention when it begins to affect them. And that's why the revolution begins in the margin. And that's why the revolution begins among the most uncomfortable, because the revolution then comes around to make you all uncomfortable. And that discomfort is good, because that discomfort means that your privilege is being questioned. And so the women and the feminists and the trans and queer rights activists on the streets in Argentina reminded their Senate of that. They reminded them that abortion is happening, whether you like it or not. So make it legal so we can save women's lives. And this is a reminder here in the United States as well. And they ended their statement with the way that I want to end my talk to you today, because this is the heart of feminism in 3D, and this is the heart of the revolution, and the heart of disobeying, defying, and disrupting patriarchy. And that is, we will not be burnt this time because the fire is ours. And so I want you to go home today and remember this. The fire is yours. Fuck the patriarchy.